Hello, my name is Kyle Matthews. I'm a board member of the Canadian International Council in Montreal. We're very pleased to host David Mulroney today for a very fascinating discussion on Canada-China relations. For those of you who don't know, David Mulroney is Canada's former ambassador to China. He's one of Canada's top experts on China. I can think of no better person to join us today to kind of talk about what is happening there and what should Canada do? How should we change our foreign policy regarding China, given its kind of rise of authoritarianism, its threats against minorities and atrocities committed against minorities in China, its takeover of Hong Kong, and threats towards Taiwan. There's a lot of stuff to discuss. This is a rising power that also many people are starting to get worried about what its intentions are and how aggressive it will be to pursue what it sees as its national interest. So David, for those who don't know, he's also a fellow at the Monk School for Global Affairs, University of Toronto, and is a frequent commentator in the media on Canada-China relations. So David, we're glad to have you on behalf of the Canadian National Council. It's a pleasure. Maybe I'd just like to give you the opening floor. What should Canada do regarding its foreign policy and China?
Well, thank you, Kyle, and it's good to be back in conversation with you and with your members. And I certainly note that your chapter of the council is active on issues like this, and I'm grateful for that, because I think we do need to have more of a national debate. Where I'm going to end up is probably that this is now something more than a foreign policy challenge, although it certainly is a foreign policy challenge. But I'll try to make that case by starting with four things that are on my mind when it comes to Canada-China relations and our oft-promised, long-promised review of China policy. So here goes. My first point would be that our diplomatic policy in China, our diplomatic posture, such as it is, tends to see China as static and one-dimensional. So unchanging and one-dimensional, and that dimension that we seem to be most interested in is trade. And it's an important dimension, but it's certainly not the only one we should be paying attention to. In fact, I think it's become a little less important in recent years. And if we look at China as not static, but dynamic, I think we begin to see that China has been on a rapid upward trajectory in terms of its sense of confidence, power, and influence in the world for some time, and certainly through the new millennium. When I was in China as ambassador, I saw this on the ground as Chinese officials that I was dealing with and the leaders that I saw from time to time were taking account of the chaos in the West, the economic crisis, and accelerating their plans for China's rise to, first of all, there was national strengthening, then a regional, a position of power in the region, then regional hegemony, and now it's global. And it includes the idea now, the Chinese sees it as attainable, of a global dominance, because their impression of the United States through the Trump era, through the early days of the Biden era, certainly through things like the collapse of the US presence in Afghanistan, their sense is that they are already a competitor of the United States, and that some form of global leadership is certainly within their grasp. That being the case, Canada risks some collateral, being part of the collateral damage to China's rise. China's objectives vis-a-vis Canada are changing a little bit. One is to strip Canada away from US power and influence and to render it either a neutral player or a pro-China player. And that's not something that we have to anticipate as being on the horizon. We've already seen it. And it was evident, most evident, in the Meng Wanzhou affair, where China insulted that a medium-sized country, a small country like Canada, would seize this star in the Chinese economic world and arrest her, hold her at the request of the United States, sought to compel Canada to ignore its treaty obligations with its closest partner in the world. That's a pretty ambitious undertaking on the part of China. In the end, they failed, and their techniques included, obviously, hostage diplomacy, the very cruel imprisonment of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, but it included economic coercion. It included elite capture to a certain extent. I think one of the things that China would see from the Meng case, although they ultimately didn't get their way, they must have been satisfied by the fact that an impressive number of very senior Canadians took the Chinese policy line, that the soundest thing for us to do would be to return Ms. Meng straight away and that we could solve the problem. And so that's got to be satisfying. It's got to have Canadians shaking their heads, because as in every international question, it also suggests a rethinking of the nature of our relationship with the United States. So China's new Canada policy isn't something that we're going to see. We're already seeing it, and we seem to be ignoring it. I noticed that our ambassador the other day, in talking about the Meng case, said, well, it's this large emotional issue in our relationship is now off the table. I think it's anything but off the table. The tactics that we're seeing to work in the case of the Meng saga, we will see again. So it's far from over, and that includes hostage diplomacy. We've already seen it in terms of diplomatic bullying, the extraordinary intervention that the Consulate General in Vancouver made on simply hearing the possibility that Vancouver might be stepping up its sister city relationship with Kaohsiung in the south of Taiwan, was quite remarkable. And in earlier days, that would have resulted in somebody being called in to Canada's foreign ministry to be reminded of diplomatic propriety. If I'd said anything like that, not only in China, but in any country that I had served in, I'd have been called in. So we're seeing a degree of Chinese boldness bordering on contempt. So this is part of the collateral damage that I'm seeing. And I think, to come back to my original point, that we have to see this now as more than a foreign policy challenge, although it certainly is a foreign policy challenge. It's a foreign policy challenge, an international challenge that requires us to urgently step up training China competence for officials, not just in the foreign ministry, but in other parts of government. That includes language training, but also training in contemporary Chinese politics and culture, an awareness of China that is pretty thin on the ground in government right now. And it also requires us, if we're thinking about foreign policy and international issues, to come to terms with the reality of our own stature in the world and our own status, that we are inevitably connected to the United States. In any kind of a contest between China and the United States, and we're seeing something of that right now, our position is inevitably on the side of the United States. There's no middle ground for us. The middle ground is contested and very dangerous, and you tend to get crushed in the middle ground. And we're certainly not allies of China in a competition like that. But we seem not to be able to think that through. But in addition to being an international issue, it raises questions of national defense. And at the moment, I think the most important national defense assets are naval. They're ships and their capabilities at sea. While we've been trying to do our part, we have starved that part, and we've starved our entire armed forces. But we need to think seriously about having a serious China policy that excludes, for us as a Pacific country, much naval capability. It's an economic issue, and we've got to think about safeguarding supply chains. There's a national security dimension to that, but also how we can broaden our trade, diversify trade so that we are less vulnerable. We should take a lesson from Australia's example, where it has been vulnerable in some areas, but not so vulnerable in others. But there's certainly an economic dimension to it. But there's also a level at which it goes even broader, and it involves a range of national institutions. We need to think about the role that China might be playing in our governance, in our elections, in our municipal and provincial politics, as well as our federal politics. We need to think about the role of China in education, among other things, the research partnerships with China and Canadian universities. We need to think about the role of China in media, diaspora media, but beyond that. And it is a technique of China in the wider world to try to influence public opinion through the influencing and capturing of media. And we need to think about China's role, often inappropriate, in our communities, in diaspora communities, and certainly in terms of the unrelenting pressure it's putting on Canadians of Tibetan and Uyghur origin. When I, in an earlier life in foreign affairs, I ran the Afghanistan task force in the Privy Council office. This was in the wake of the Manley panel. And I served as the secretary to the Manley panel. And that was a distinguished group that included, in addition to John Manley, Jacob, Derek Burney, Paul Tellier, and it traveled through Canada, through Europe, to Afghanistan, spent more time in Afghanistan than any other Canadian group doing any kind of survey whatsoever. And the recommendation was that, and these were people who were very, very wise in the ways of, oh, I should have mentioned Senator Pamela Wallin as well. These are people who were very wise in the ways of Canadian governance. And they said, every decade or so, you face a challenge, they called it a once in a decade challenge, that requires you to reinvent government, to think about government in new ways. Their experiences were mostly with things like, the Auto Pact and Canada, US free trade. But they said that Afghanistan was a once in a decade problem. And it required a restructuring of government, the creation of a cabinet committee answering to the prime minister. They said this is an issue the prime minister has to own. And it involved setting up a task force at PCO, which I came to run as a deputy minister, convening the various parts of government that needed to be coordinated if we were to deliver on the recommendations of the Manley panel, which had been endorsed by Parliament. I think China is more than a once in a decade problem, and I think ultimately it's going to take a government, if not this one, maybe the next one. I certainly hope it's the next one, to reorganize, to have an ability to look at China issues across government. And one of the things you see if you spend any time in China is that it is profoundly coordinated. Its Canada policy is linked and coordinated right across every part of the Chinese government that has anything to do with Canada. We will never be that way, and thank God for the differences, but we certainly should aspire to be much more connected and coordinated than we are. So I think ultimately foreign policy and diplomacy will play part of it, but it's a much larger challenge to us, and the challenge is directly to our sovereignty, to our autonomy as a country. And I'll stop there.
Thank you for that, your opening comments and overview, David. One thing that jumped out at me was you mentioned that there's a focus in trying to pry Canada away from the U.S., one of our closest allies, NATO member, our biggest trade partner. And I just couldn't happen but notice that today, President Biden and Xi are actually having a cyber summit. They're meeting today. What are some of the main issues there that you think they'll be discussing, and which ones are really relevant to Canada, not just the U.S., but to, as you say, China's been seen as an international threat on a bunch of issues for some of our allies. What will the U.S. be bringing up with the Chinese leadership, and what should Canadians look for?
First, there's always something that I'm wary of whenever you have high-level meetings with the Chinese leadership, because they've very successfully transformed what should be a transactional encounter into a gift that is bestowed on countries for good behavior. So the very fact that there's a meeting with Xi is seen as a Chinese concession that needs to be paid for in terms of American compliance. You have to be very careful in dealings like this with China, that you're not already on the hind foot. I think the agenda for this will be, to a certain extent, set by China. It will certainly include a defensive posture on Taiwan and an effort to either persuade or intimidate the United States to step back from its efforts to defend and support Taiwan. There will be an effort by China to transform its minimalist contribution at the COP meeting to a gradual transition away from coal, to that, turning that into a selfless contribution that China has made to the world order, as opposed to something that China desperately needs to do itself, given the environmental catastrophe that it faces. So there'll be an effort to barter that for U.S. behavior, a U.S. concession somewhere else. And then there'll be a warning, I think, they've been rattled a little bit by the U.S., UK, Australia partnership in the Indo-Pacific region, and there'll be a warning against alliance building, when alliance building is an obvious response to China's aggressive behavior in many, many places. So I think Xi will probably dominate the discussion, and it will focus on these, it'll show us what China's objectives in the world are, and Taiwan right now, unfortunately, is at the center of that.
So David, there's two things I'd like to dig a bit deeper. One is domestically. You mentioned that there was kind of a push for Canada to get past the emotional aspect of having our two Michaels taking hostage, not having legal representation, basically kept in squalid conditions for almost 3 years. And I think that's a scar that runs deep. Do you feel that we like to say that Canadian foreign policy is made by foreign policy experts, but sometimes the domestic aspect of relations with other countries can also have an impact. What is your view on how Canadians now view China after this? Is it something that is not really being paid to, or has it struck the Canadian psyche much deeper than the Chinese thought, perhaps?
Well, I thank God for the Canadian response to China, because Canadians, as usual, are showing common sense in responding to some very egregious behavior on the part of China. And that's the only thing I think that's keeping the government honest to the extent that it's willing to be tough on China at all. It's a recognition that this is important to Canadians. One of the things that perplexes me is that the Prime Minister has done something that's interesting, and it's kind of inside baseball, but it's more than that. And that is he's changed what ambassadors are and what they do when it comes to China. So that after my successor, the very capable professional diplomat Guy Saint-Jacques, he named John McCallum, who was a former cabinet minister, as his ambassador. And the idea was that he could speak directly to the Prime Minister, that they would have this relationship. And Mr. McCallum's position on China, to the extent that we are aware of it from his speeches and from some of the things that we know about his work, was, I'd say, promotional. The idea, he used to say at his China meetings, he would end them by saying, "Gang duo," even more, let's do more. It was a kind of comprehensive engagement, pedal to the metal. If it's an idea comes from China, it's got to be a good idea. He and his ambassadorship kind of imploded at the start of the Meng Wanzhou captivity, the Meng Wanzhou situation in Vancouver. He was followed by Dominic Barton, which to me was a really unusual choice, in that we already knew that we were in the midst of this Meng struggle. And Dominic Barton, as the former world head of McKinsey, had been a tremendous booster of China and of Xi Jinping's Belt and Road program. And he said himself that he had drunk the Kool-Aid. He was a very unusual choice to put into China at that time. And to a certain extent, now that the Meng Wanzhou story is behind us, thank God, he sort of wants to get back to that. So he's someone who I think is curiously focused not on where China's going, but on this idea of returning to a status quo that never existed. So the Prime Minister has, although he says he's given up his naivete about China, his ambassadorial picks seem to reflect his earlier position. And we've seen this throughout the government, where ministers have been extolling China on its pandemic response. When China suggested that it would like to step up its ambitions in the Arctic, we welcomed that. There's almost nothing that China can say or do that we don't think still is a good idea. So the Canadian public concerns about China are the only thing I think that's keeping our policy on track to the extent that it is on track. The other thing I'd note that's very interesting to me as a former official is, if you read whenever the Globe and Mail does an access to information request and gets a policy document on China, the position of Ottawa and the department seems to be much tougher and much more realistic than the impression in the embassy. And recently, when Mr. Barton said what he did about this emotional issue being now off the table, there was a course correction that came from a departmental spokesperson back in Ottawa. So there's a disconnect in our diplomacy, which I think is also not only confusing but dangerous, because then you have a public service that can't be coordinated because foreign policy itself is uncoordinated.
David, putting aside the two Michaels, and I don't think that we've gone back to normal, and I don't think Canadians will forget this for some time. But there's also the issue about the pandemic. We're almost 2 years into the pandemic. We've seen, I live in Quebec. There have been more deaths in Quebec from COVID than in all of China. It seems hard to believe. Countries around the world are going on lockdown again, but we haven't had any transparency from China. And we've also had the original, one of the original journalists, citizen journalists that reported on the outbreak is actually on her deathbed on a hunger strike in China. How much has the COVID pandemic, and I would say perhaps the cover up and the disinformation coming from Beijing, how do you think that's affected trust in China among Canadians, but also about people across the world?
The pandemic is an example of a lesson tragically unlearned by Canada, but it's one we just failed to learn. I was running the Asia branch back when SARS, another pandemic or global epidemic, was let loose, and it came out of South China, and it spread in part because the Chinese authorities were not quick to share the necessary information, and in fact seemed to have obfuscated. And it had a particularly lethal impact in Canada and here in Toronto and in Vancouver. So we suffered greatly from that. The one difference, of course, was that China was not quite as powerful and influential, and they were rebuked by the World Health Organization for their failure to share information. What we've seen this time is a China that's much more globally integrated. And so, in fact, there are more flights going out of China. That we're more connected is mainly a good thing, but it can be a very bad thing in a time of pandemic. But a China that was able to manipulate the World Health Organization to a great extent, and that also got and this is inexplicable to me, got a free pass from people who should have been more skeptical. And our own health minister at the time was one of those people. The ambassador also extolled China's response. For some mind-boggling reason, we decided to joint venture with a Chinese entity when it came to vaccine production, which ended mysteriously, but although not so mysteriously. I think China simply turned the screws on us because of the Meng Wanzhou situation. But our pandemic response when it came to China and holding China was almost farcical. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of a story that looks very suspicious. I also don't think it's entirely a Chinese story. My own guess would be that China allowed its facilities and encouraged its facilities to be used by international interests that may have contributed to the creation of the pandemic. I think that's the most likely story. But it is also a story of China's connection to the global system, but its free riding and its evasion of the rules and regulations of the global system in ways that are increasingly costly beyond its borders.
Thanks, David. The other, David, I think the issue here that's standing out is that, Canadians, we like to talk a lot about human rights. We like to really kind of say that human rights are the basis of our foreign policy. And we've also have had a wake-up call domestically about how we've treated our Indigenous minorities and the whole history. And I want to ask you, how can we as a society argue that we should engage and trade with China and get more integrated economically when we have the case of what's happening to the Uyghurs, over 1 million Turkic Muslims that are incarcerated, destruction of heritage property. There's been a massive cover up by Beijing about what's happening there. I just wonder, should that not be a red flag that says if they treat their own citizens this way, how can we even, how can we know that they're going to talk to us and be truthful? What's the case of the Uyghurs, and what's the lessons for Canadian foreign policy going forward?
Well, we're in the process of sending our team to the Winter Olympics in China, and we're knowingly going to participate in games hosted by a state that is, I believe, committing genocide. And our parliament has said that it's committing genocide, that they believe that too, and other parliaments have said the same thing. The evidence is overwhelming. This is a tremendous victory for the Chinese state. It's showing that it can get away with anything, that even in the midst of a genocide, the world will come. And I don't believe for a minute, well, I think there are some people who are convinced by the argument that our athletes have trained so hard that they deserve this opportunity. I think as I'm sympathetic to our athletes, but I think that's a very weak argument. I think the real argument that the government is doing this, and the government normally misses no opportunity to virtue signal, is that they're afraid not to participate. We boycotted the Russian Olympics in the wake of their invasion of Afghanistan, in part because we knew we could do it with impunity. The government is afraid to do it now. And this is another example of the narrowing of our autonomy. Our sovereignty as a nation, who we are, is diminished. I've argued that we should not attend the Olympics, not simply as a boycott, and I understand that boycotts don't always work, and I think China would be sure to make sure it didn't work in this time, but on a moral basis. We can't attend these games, given everything we know about China's human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and be Canada, that it's immoral to do this, but we're going to do it, and we're going to be happy to forget about it. There's an economic dimension. We've got to be doing more, and there was some reporting recently that we're still seeing on Canadian shelves products that are coming out of factories in Xinjiang, but we're also seeing major sponsors and advertisers, the kind of people who lecture us endlessly at home, participating in these games. So it's a tremendous failure. It will empower China, and the worst thing about this genocide, in addition to its horrible impact on people, is that it is future oriented. It's a highly sophisticated, very, very coordinated effort to eliminate a people and to wipe a culture off the map. And don't think that this isn't going to be something that China exports. It doesn't export to other places, that China is not being studied by other dictatorships. So this isn't, Canada is very good at looking at atrocities in the past. We're great at seeing them in the rearview mirror. We're not so good when it comes to confronting them as they're happening, because guess what? It takes a lot of courage, and it's much more difficult to do that. And we're failing once again. And I guarantee that in 20 to 30 years, people will look back and say, how did we ever do that? Did we not know? Yeah, we knew about it. We didn't do it because it was just too damn hard to do anything about it. And I'm ashamed that we're doing it.
Thanks, David. I'm going to ask people in the audience, if you have a question, please don't be afraid to enter into the chat function any specific question. Waiting for the questions to come in, David, I'll just mention that this weekend, the Chinese Foreign Ministry put out a very terse statement against Human Rights Watch. Ken Roth and his team have been sending letters to all the main sponsors of the Olympics, warning them about the human rights abuses. And I think they only had one response, but it definitely set off a nerve in Beijing. So I have one question coming in, and it wants to know about Huawei, and particularly 5G, and says, why is Canada one of the only members of the Five Eyes that has not banned Huawei yet? What explains that? Oh, David, you're on mute. Sorry.
There is no sound explanation for that. I think first of all, we should be cognizant of what our allies are doing, and cooperation with our allies is important to us. Secondly, even before going through what we had to go through on the Meng Wanzhou case, it would have been inadvisable in the extreme to allow China into the very heart of our next generation communications in this country. But we also have to remember that China invoked its cruel punishment on Canada and on two Canadians in particular, specifically because of what they thought was an insult to Huawei and to its senior executive. China doesn't get involved in every case where Chinese citizens are detained. This was something different. So the notion that we would partner with a company, or with a country that and a company where we'd already been put through the ringer for an alleged abuse of that company is mind-boggling to me. I think it relates to the fact that the government has decided not to be specifically clear about China. You have to piece things together, a ship transit here, a statement there, but they're desperately afraid of speaking out. That's another win for China, by the way. But it also guarantees that our policy at home will be uncoordinated, because the first community that gets confused when the government doesn't speak clearly or doesn't speak at all is the Canadian Public Service. And that's why, for example, you've had those embarrassing stories about approving metal detecting equipment made by a Chinese company, or contracts given to China, because there's no order. The first standing order in the Public Service of Canada should be, if it involves China, think again and ask your boss. Don't automatically approve it. We've gone off autopilot. And because the government has been so afraid to say anything, even something as reasonable as saying, given the experience we've had with China, we don't think that we can have a Chinese company at the heart of our telecommunications establishment, that they're afraid even to do that it beggars belief. And it only suggests that we're in for more confusion and possibly more pain going forward.
So, David, I'm having quite a few questions are coming in. Let me go through. Says, thank you, Ambassador Mulroney. My questions. One, given that both China and Taiwan have applied to join the CPTPP, how should Canada react? And two, should Canada seek to join the AU, KUS, and Quad?
So I think I don't see a happy ending on the China-Taiwan application to join this new trade organization. And I think what's going to happen, the best case scenario is that they're both allowed to join. The next best case scenario is that neither is allowed to join if China insists on blocking Taiwan. But I think the most likely scenario is that China will join. And I used to run our office in Taiwan way back when, from 1998 to 2001. I was there when the Democratic Progressive Party defeated the Kuomintang. You had this tremendous upsurge in Taiwanese awareness of themselves as a separate place that had evolved differently over time, that you had the use of Taiwanese as opposed to Mandarin, or Taiwanese recognized equally with Mandarin. It was a tremendously exciting time. But I also saw Ottawa's tendency to self-censor. Our one China policy allows us to do quite a bit in Taiwan, and we've gradually been whittling that back. That's another example of our silence vis-a-vis China. The best thing we could do with Taiwan is to step up our exchanges in many, many areas where we can have exchanges. If you look at the government of Taiwan and its leader, Tsai Ing-wen, this should be if Tsai Ing-wen were leading a government anywhere else in the world, she would be on Prime Minister Trudeau's speed dial. She is a progressive, liberal leader of a country, and this for a prime minister that is supposedly leading a feminist foreign policy is a no-brainer. But we lack the courage to go as far as we should go. We're not going to be. We don't have the background or the capability to provide Taiwan with defensive weapons as the U.S. does, but a more robust and active Canadian engagement with Taiwan would send a message that this isn't just a Sino-American dispute. Many countries believe that Taiwan should be protected and allowed to, and the citizens of Taiwan should be respected when it comes to making a choice about their future. This can be done carefully, acknowledging that China has real red lines and would go to war over Taiwan, as inexplicable as that may be. It needs to be done carefully, but it should be done resolutely, and we're failing that. On the the Australia, US, UK, Indo-Pacific arrangement, there's a geographic element to that, obviously, and part of this allows Australia access to US submarine technology so they can be more active in the Pacific. I think ultimately we should aspire to partnership with those. There are the most like-minded countries we have in the world, but we simply lack the capability. You don't get invited to things if you don't invest in the capability to be part of it. So we need to think very carefully about that. I don't think, I saw there's a report in the Globe that we're going to wrap our China policy thinking into an Indo-Pacific strategy. I think that's a bad idea. If we haven't been able to get the strategy around a single country right, it's very unlikely that we're going to get a regional strategy right. And Ottawa is there's a sort of a policy graveyard where regional strategies go to die. First thing we've got to do is get China right. And China is, as I've said, more than a foreign policy challenge. But getting China right and building up the muscle mass to defend Canadian interests, to stand up and to respect China, to engage in dialogue with China, but not in the obsequious way that we've been doing it, would be the single best thing we could do in the Indo-Pacific region. But we should spend as much time trying to understand India as we should on China. And I suspect there that there's a significant deficit as well. So there's no excuse for not getting more involved, but it starts with an investment in people and in technologies and in capabilities. And we've allowed all of those to diminish and decline in recent years.
I couldn't agree more that we should be investing more in our people to have more capabilities to think these things through, David. We have a question coming in from Twitter. And this, I think, dovetails nicely, David, with you said that China is not just a foreign policy issue, but there's also a domestic element too. And this question is following: how should the Canadian government protect the Chinese diaspora in Canada, many who face threats here? So there have been reports about Hong Kong activists, Uyghur activists being targeted, harassed. What are your thoughts on this issue?
A couple of years ago, I wrote a piece for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute where I said that we should have a registry of foreign agents. And what that means is, if you're acting on behalf of another country, or and it's not just lobbying, we have a lobbyist registry, but if you're speaking, you're going into the media to deliver the talking points of another country, you have to be transparent about that. And if you're a former government official, that obligation would last for most government officials 15 years, and for senior government officials, it's a lifetime obligation. If you had the privilege of serving the Canadian people, you have to think of that as a lifetime opportunity, but also a lifetime obligation. Australia has implemented something like that, and they've also stepped up their investigation using their intelligence agencies and enforcement. So failure to comply results in criminal sanctions. So I would radically step up our ability to require people who are acting for foreign states to identify themselves. I'd also step up activities where Chinese diplomats are found to be stepping over the line. Whenever China was upset with Canada, if they got wind of a visit by, for example, the Dalai Lama, I'd get called into the foreign ministry. That's the one discipline you can have. If you tell the ambassador he or she has to show up at a certain time on a certain day, you have to show up. And generally it's to get yelled at by the home foreign ministry. I can recall on one occasion when they got word that the Dalai Lama might be coming to Canada, I was told to come at 9 p.m. on a Saturday night. And I was brought to the foreign ministry and put in a darkened room where I sat for 45 minutes. Then I went into a boardroom where there were 12 people seated there, and they all took shots at me for about an hour, and how I was responsible for torpedoing the relationship, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't let it get into my head, but I had to work at it. We treat the Chinese ambassador. He travels around Canada as a distinguished guest. He's given a platform to speak. We're very careful with the consulates. The single best thing we could do would be to drop the weight the next time they overstep the line, up to and including sending someone home. They would reciprocate, but reducing the number of Chinese diplomats, particularly those who are harassing members of the diaspora or any Canadians, would be a net advantage. It's a little bit like hockey. If you skate through the goal crease, you're going to get whacked with the goalie stick. We haven't been deploying the goalie stick or the pads for some time. And when you get tough, China will pick the next weaker. Unfortunately, now we're seen as one of the weaker countries. I've said that I think our aspiration is to be the fourth toughest country in the Five Eyes, acknowledging that New Zealand will be always a little less tough than Canada. That's not where Canada used to be. So we've got to get much tougher. We've got to indicate that we have the ability to investigate and to punish activities that transcend, that go beyond what diplomats are allowed to do. There's another example where consulates are empowering student groups to, or they're getting involved even in student elections where people are excluded because of their positions or because of their ethnicity, even within China. That's another example where we've got to get much tougher.
Thank you, David. And thank you for using the hockey analogy and talking about foreign affairs. I think that's probably the best way to get Canadians more interested in what's happening across the globe. We have a question coming in from Henri Lautin. Henri is asking, can you address Canada's relationship with reaction to developments in Hong Kong? And can Canadians, including those receiving immigration approval, can they get out?
Hong Kong is big, because China is guilty of so many things, and it's engaging in aggressive activities on so many fronts. Hong Kong isn't getting the attention that it deserves. Hong Kong is also a case where Canada dropped the ball. I was in Ottawa and back in Canada at the time of Hong Kong's retrocession. And I remember the promises that China and Britain were looking for from countries like Canada, that we would support the deal, that we would, and Britain in particular, was that we would do our bit to ensure that one country, two systems was a reality, that we would support Hong Kong institutions. We said, yes, yes, go ahead, God bless. And then we failed to act. And we watched while China really broke down institutions in Hong Kong, where it began to erode human rights, media, free media, a range of things that made Hong Kong. And then I think everybody was taken by surprise, but shouldn't have been, by Xi Jinping's decisive intervention in the last couple of years to basically complete this. So we should be deeply concerned. Canada, the UK, and Australia have all enacted programs to make it a little bit easier for people who are in Canada from Hong Kong to stay or to get to Canada. It's tragic, though, that's where we're at, where the only thing we can do is to help people to get out. And the world has basically watched as China has extinguished a light for freedom in Asia. The only good thing coming out of this is I think it's strengthened resolve not to let it happen in Taiwan, but Hong Kong is a disaster.
So, David, there's a more of a comment than a question, but I'd like to get your feedback based on your experience in dealing with Chinese officials and how they think. But Monty McMurky states, Canadian strategy must never forget the innately realist nature of the Chinese strategy that it is seeking to defeat. Chinese leaders respect strength and are contemptuous of weakness.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And this is where I've been embarrassed and chagrined by our tendency in communications with China to flatter. You notice when the Chinese speak to us, they may invoke Bethune, or there'll be a few platitudes, but they generally don't flatter. They're pretty much on the money. I'm not suggesting that we need to be rude or disrespectful. In diplomacy, you should always respect should always be your first option. Listening attentively, trying to understand positions, that's part of it. But you don't need to flatter. If only we'd simply based our responses on the facts that were known to us. So when I went back and I looked at some of the things that senior people in government said about the Chinese response to coronavirus, to the pandemic, well before any of the facts were in, I was embarrassed. And we see this again and again. If we simply stopped flattering and started listening more, we'd do a lot better. But and once you start flattering, China knows that they've got you. They know that it's all over. No more negotiation. They can drive this as far as they need to. Unfortunately, one of the things I'm also interested in, and I just did a piece last week for the U.S. magazine First Things, has been the Vatican's strategy vis-a-vis China and Hong Kong. And the Vatican has also embraced this strategy of praising and pretending bad things aren't happening, and it's leading them to a disaster diplomatically, but also a disaster for Catholic faithful in China and possibly for the people of Taiwan. So calling things as they are, being straight and honest and direct is always recommended. And it's important with the Chinese, but it's important just about everywhere. And if you approach it from weakness or in a subservient way, China in particular will consider consider that the victory has already been won.
So I have another question coming in from some following us online, actually a CIC board member, Andres Friedman. Andres is asking, why are Western countries failing at adopting a strong multilateral approach to prevent CCP economic bullying? When China applies sanctions, Canada, Australia, we are unable to pressure them to change course.
And that's, it's a great frustration. It has a lot to do with the fact that we're also natural competitors and that we operate, according to a free market system. I was encouraged that Canada was doing a little bit of thinking on efforts to combat China's economic coercion, but all too often the response is to stand by as China, whether it's Scottish salmon or Australian coal or wine. It's going to take some work to figure out how to do that exactly and what kind of response other countries should apply, but it is essential. And I'm aware of at least one paper that emanated from Canada on a sort of a multilateral approach to this, where China would pay through some kind of sanctions. I suspect it will start with a smaller group, and maybe a small group of like-minded. I've suggested that this would be an area where Canada, after being a laggard for so long, could show some leadership, possibly convening Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and a few partners in the EU to come up with some specific mechanisms that would come into place when China does this. The other thing, of course, to look at is a form of diversification, which we have been really slow to consider. Diversification, first and most importantly, when it comes to strategic materials, but also when it comes to key sectors. The other thing that is undeniable is that over time, and China knows this, countries like Canada, particularly Canada, but also Australia, have the advantage when it comes to agricultural commodities that China will need. It's ridiculous that we fear China's economic coercion when we know that within 10 to 20 years, China will be at our doorstep as a demandeur. So we've got to keep that in mind too. That maybe some real discussions with China about their long-term interests behind closed doors are also important, to say that if you bully us, don't forget that we will be a country that you come to when if environmental trends continue and the loss of arable land continues, you need us desperately. Some hard talking to China is probably in order. China is always better at this than we are, in part because they can also control their system. When China takes targets a Canadian commodity, for example, we can hold for a while, but not forever, because given that we are a democracy, and thank God for that, we will hear from the part of Canada that is suffering, and we will feel for our fellow Canadians and try to find a way out of it. China can hold together because you never hear from the part of China that is suffering. They can, even though they're feeling great pain, they can withstand it for a long time. So I think more policy work is needed here, but start small with a few like-minded and see if we can get something simple off the ground. And also working with Australia and others, start telling the truth to China about who owns the long-term advantage when it comes to strategic commodities and food commodities. I'm not suggesting that we starve China, but we need to tell them some hard truths about how the global economy works and will work.
So David, I'm going to ask you one last question. I know you've given us a lot of your time and we're approaching the hour that we've had you for the discussion. So the last question is from Diego Osorio. And he says, what do you think of the lack of coordination on China's policies between the provinces and the federal government? The Canadian province and federal government, provincial teams were scouting, prodding, and partaking with Chinese counterparts when we had two fellow Canadians held hostage in the same country. I can think of the former Premier of Nova Scotia that kind of dismissed us taking this seriously. I'm wondering what you can talk about this which is much more of a domestic issue for us.
Yeah, it's appalling. I can recall a very difficult negotiation we had with the Chinese that affected a commodity coming from a particular province. And we had that province working with the Chinese and lobbying us and upsetting the apple cart and telling the Chinese that our position wasn't our final position, et cetera, et cetera. So our Team Canada is not particularly robust. It's a fact of life. I can tell you that it happens less when you have strong prime ministerial leadership. It happens more when you don't, and that we had it in the midst of the detention, the cruel detention of our 2 Canadians, is something that ultimately the citizens of those provinces need to think about in a political system. And sometimes at the local level, you're not getting that attention to national level issues. And that's where a call from a strong prime minister can have a profound effect.
David, on behalf of the Canadian National Council, and particularly the branch in Montreal, I want to thank you for talking to us about Canada-China relations, for sharing your insights, your expertise, and for giving us something to think about how we have to be more strategic as a society as a whole. And I think there's a lot of interesting things that you propose that we should push up the chain of command for those who work in academia or journalism and so forth. So thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much. Great to talk with you all.